The girl didn't cry when Elijah Cole lifted her from that darkness. She simply stared at him with eyes that had forgotten what sunlight looked like, her pupils contracting slowly against the lantern glow, her cracked lips forming words that never came. The chain around her ankle clinked against the stone floor as she tried to draw her knees up to her chest, tried to make herself smaller, tried to disappear into the corner where she had clearly spent months pressed against cold earth and damp walls. She was wearing what might have once been a dress, but was now little more than rags held together by frayed thread and dried blood. Her hair hung in matted clumps across her face, and her wrists bore the purple and yellow bruises of bindings that had been removed and replaced so many times the skin had given up healing. Elijah felt his heart crack down the middle like dry timber in winter. He had come to this property looking for a lost calf that had wandered through a broken fence line. He had not come looking for this. He had not come looking for a 14-year-old girl chained in the basement of what everyone in Stillwater believed was an abandoned homestead at the edge of Mercer's land. The smell alone should have warned him something was wrong, that thick, rotting sweetness that spoke of desperation and suffering, and things left too long without care. But he had assumed it was a dead animal, maybe the calf he was searching for, maybe something worse but still animal, still something his mind could accept and file away into the ordinary horrors of frontier life. He had not expected to push open that cellar door and find a child staring back at him like he was death finally come to collect her. She did not flinch when he took a step closer. She simply lowered her gaze to the floor and waited, her thin shoulders rising and falling with shallow breaths, her fingers curling around the edge of her torn sleeve as if preparing herself for whatever came next. Elijah had seen suffering before. He had buried his wife 3 winters ago when the fever took her in the night. He had carried his own daughter, small and still and cold, to a grave he dug himself beside the cottonwood tree behind the barn. He knew what it looked like when something innocent had been broken by a world that did not care. But this was different. This was deliberate. This was evil with intention, and it made his blood run cold even as his hands began to shake with a rage he had not felt in years. But let us go back to where it all started, to the morning before Elijah Cole's life changed forever, when the sun rose over the Dakota plains like it had every other morning that spring, slow and golden, and indifferent to the small dramas of human existence. Elijah had woken before dawn as he always did, his body tuned to the rhythm of ranch work that had defined his life for the past 20 years. He was 43 years old and looked 10 years older, his face weathered by sun and grief in equal measure, his hands calloused and scarred from the endless labor of keeping 100 head of cattle fed and watered and protected from the wolves that still prowled the territory when winters grew harsh. His ranch sat 3 miles outside the town of Stillwater, a collection of wooden buildings and dusty streets that called itself a community, but was really just a gathering of souls too stubborn or too broken to keep moving west. There was a general store run by the Hardings, a blacksmith named Cooper who could fix anything with iron and fire, a saloon that served whiskey too strong and food too weak, and a church where Pastor Whitfield delivered sermons about sin and redemption every Sunday to pews filled with people who needed both. Elijah went to church because his wife had loved it, because sitting in that wooden room with sunlight streaming through warped glass windows still made him feel connected to her memory, even if the words Pastor Whitfield spoke often felt hollow and distant from the actual struggles of daily survival. That morning, Elijah had noticed the break in his north fence line and the fresh tracks leading toward the old Brennan place, a homestead that had been abandoned 4 years ago when Thomas Brennan died of consumption and his widow packed up their children and headed back east to family who could help raise them. The property had sat empty ever since, its windows dark, its fields returning to wild grass, its buildings slowly surrendering to weather and time. Or so everyone believed. Elijah had no reason to think otherwise as he saddled his horse and followed the calf's tracks across the morning grass, the dew soaking through his boots, the meadowlark singing from the fence posts like nothing in the world was wrong. He found the calf a quarter mile from the Brennan property, tangled in old wire near a collapsed section of their barn. He freed the animal, checked it for injuries, and was about to head back when the wind shifted. Ted and brought that smell to him, that terrible, unmistakable smell that made his stomach turn and his instincts sharpen. He should have ignored it. He should have taken his calf and gone home and lived the rest of his life without knowing what was hidden in that cellar. But Elijah Cole had never been good at ignoring things that felt wrong, and so he tied his horse to the broken fence and walked toward the house with the morning sun warming his back and no idea that each step was carrying him toward a moment from which there would be no return. The lock on the cellar door was new. That was the first thing he noticed, a shiny brass padlock on a door that should have been rusted and neglected like everything else on this property. He stood there for a long moment, staring at that lock, his mind trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he expected to see. Then he heard it, a small sound, barely audible, like an animal in pain. It came from below, from the darkness beneath that door. Elijah did not think. He grabbed a rusted shovel from the debris near the barn, wedged it behind the lock's housing, and wrenched until the wood splintered and gave way. The door swung open, and the smell hit him like a physical force, making him stagger back and cover his nose with his sleeve. He descended the stairs with his heart pounding in his chest, his lantern casting jumping shadows on walls that were slick with moisture and mold. And there she was, huddled in the corner, chained like livestock, staring at him with eyes that held nothing but exhausted surrender. He did not know her name. He did not know how long she had been here or who had put her here or what terrors she had endured in this underground hell. But he knew, with a certainty that went beyond thought into something primal and absolute, that he was going to get her out. He was going to break that chain, and he was going to find whoever was responsible and make them answer for this evil. The chain was old iron, thick and heavy, anchored to a ring that had been newly mortared into the stone wall. Elijah studied it for a moment, then went back upstairs and found a heavy hammer in the debris of the collapsed barn. When he returned, the girl had not moved. She watched him approach with that same blank acceptance, her body bracing for impact, her eyes never quite meeting his. He knelt beside her, close enough that he could see the individual scars on her thin arms, the places where her skin had been broken and healed and broken again. She smelled like fear and waste and something else, something underneath it all that reminded him of wildflowers after rain, the stubborn sweetness of something alive that refused to be extinguished. He wanted to tell her she was safe now. He wanted to promise that no one would ever hurt her again. But he had learned long ago that words meant nothing without action to back them up, so instead he simply said, his voice rough and quiet in that terrible space, "I am going to break this chain. I am going to take you somewhere safe. You do not have to trust me, but I need you to hold still." She did not respond. She just turned her face away and closed her eyes, and Elijah felt something inside him harden into cold resolve as he raised the hammer and brought it down on the weakest link of the chain. It took 4 blows, 4 echoing strikes that seemed to shake the very foundations of that cursed house. When the chain finally gave way, the girl did not run. She did not cry. She simply looked down at her ankle, at the iron cuff that still encircled her flesh, at the broken chain that now hung loose instead of binding her to the wall. And for the first time, something flickered in those hollow eyes, something that might have been hope, or might have been disbelief, or might have been the first stirring of an emotion so long suppressed that even she did not recognize it anymore. Elijah carried her out of that basement and into the morning light, her weight almost nothing in his arms, her body curling against his chest like a wounded bird. She squinted against the sun, her face turning away from its brightness, her thin hand rising to shield her eyes. He did not know how long she had been kept in that darkness, but he knew it had been long enough that daylight felt like an assault. He set her gently on the grass beside his horse and knelt in front of her, trying to make himself less threatening, trying to find the right words for a situation no words could fit. She was looking at the sky, looking at the clouds drifting overhead, looking at the world she had been stolen from with an expression of quiet wonder that broke his heart all over again. He said, "My name is Elijah. I have a ranch not far from here. I am going to take you there and get you cleaned up and fed. Then we are going to figure out who did this to you and what happens next. Can you tell me your name?" She was silent for so long he thought she had not heard him. Then, her voice barely a whisper, rough from disuse and screaming and all the sounds that had probably been beaten out of her, she said, "Sarah." Just that one word. Just her name, offered like a fragile gift she was not sure he deserved to receive. Elijah nodded slowly. He lifted her onto his horse, climbed up behind her, and turned toward home. The calf he had come for wandered somewhere in the distance, forgot. He would find it later, or he would not. Right now, the only thing that mattered was the girl trembling in his arms, and the terrible knowledge of what human beings were capable of doing to one another when they believed no one was watching. He brought her home and set her in the chair by the fire his wife used to love. He heated water in the big copper tub and left clean clothes outside the door, clothes that had belonged to his daughter, stored in a cedar chest he had not opened since the day he buried her. Sarah did not speak as she bathed. She did not speak as she dressed. She did not speak as she sat at his table and ate the soup he prepared with the mechanical motions of someone who had forgotten what it felt like to not be hungry. But she was watching him. He could feel her eyes following his movements, assessing him, trying to understand what kind of man he was and what he wanted from her. He knew that look. He had seen it in the eyes of wild horses and abused dogs and every creature that had learned to fear the hand that was supposed to care for them. He did not try to talk to her. He simply went about his evening routine, feeding the animals, checking the fences, doing all the small tasks that needed doing while the sun set over the prairie and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink that no painter could ever truly capture. When he came back inside, Sarah was still sitting at the table, but her eyes were closed and her breathing had slowed into the rhythm of exhausted sleep. He did not move her. He simply covered her with a blanket and sat in the chair across the room, watching over her through the night, his shotgun across his knees and his mind turning over the question that would haunt him for days to come. Who had done this? And what would they do when they discovered their prisoner was gone? Word traveled fast in small towns, carried on the breath of gossips and the curiosity of neighbors who had nothing better to do than track the movements of everyone around them. By the next afternoon, half of Stillwater knew that Elijah Cole had brought home a girl, a ragged creature who flinched at loud noises and would not meet anyone's eyes. Some thought she was a relative, perhaps a niece from back east fallen on hard times. Others whispered darker theories, that she was a runaway, that she was trouble, that Elijah had finally lost his mind to loneliness and grief, and was doing something that would bring shame to everyone associated with him. Martha Harding was the first to arrive, her face pinched with concern and curiosity in equal measure, her arms carrying a basket of fresh bread and preserves that served as both offering and excuse. She stood on Elijah's porch and looked past him to where Sarah sat by the window, wrapped in a quilt, staring at the world outside with an expression of cautious wonder. Martha's eyes widened as she took in the girl's thin frame, the healing bruises visible on her wrists, the haunted quality of her gaze that spoke of horrors no child should ever know. She asked, her voice low and careful, "Elijah, who is this child? Where did she come from?" He told her. Not everything, some details were too terrible to speak aloud, but enough. Enough for Martha's face to pale and her hand to rise to her mouth and her eyes to fill with tears that she quickly blinked away. She whispered, "Dear God, that poor creature. And on the Brennan property, you say? But who would?" She stopped herself. She did not finish the question because they both knew the answer was too terrible to contemplate and too important to ignore. Someone in this community, or near it, had chained a child in a basement and left her there to suffer. Someone they might know. Someone they might pass on the street or sit beside in church or trust with their own children's safety. The thought was unbearable, and yet it had to be borne because the evidence was sitting right there by the window, breathing and blinking and alive despite everything that had been done to destroy her. Not everyone responded with compassion. Elijah had expected that, had prepared himself for the suspicion and judgment that would inevitably come, but it still stung when it arrived in the form of Jacob Prescott, and 2 of his ranch hands riding up to his property 3 days after he found Sarah. Prescott was a wealthy man, one of the largest landowners in the territory, with a voice that carried weight in town meetings and a reputation for speaking his mind regardless of who it offended. He sat on his horse and looked down at Eli, jaw with an expression of barely concealed disapproval, and said, "Cole, I hear you have taken in some vagrant girl. Brought her into your home without knowing anything about her or where she came from. People are talking. People are concerned." Elijah felt his jaw tight. He asked, keeping his voice level, "Concerned about what exactly?" Prescott shifted in his saddle. He said, "Concerned that you are harboring someone who might be trouble, might be wanted somewhere. Might have run away from a lawful situation for reasons we do not understand. Have you even contacted the sheriff? Have you made any attempt to find out if someone is looking for this girl?" Elijah thought about the chain around Sarah's ankle. He thought about the bruises on her body and the scars on her skin and the way she still woke screaming in the night from dreams he could not protect her from. He said, "I found her chained in a basement, Jacob, like an animal, like something less than human. If someone is looking for her, then I want to meet them. I want to look into their eyes and ask them what kind of person does that to a child, and then I want to watch them hang for it." Prescott's expression flickered, surprise perhaps, or something harder to read. He said, "That is a serious accusation. You are talking about crimes, about punishment, about things that require evidence and law and proper authority." Elijah stepped closer to Prescott's horse, close enough that he had to look up to meet the man's eyes. He said, quiet and cold, "I have all the evidence I need sleeping in my house. I have all the evidence I need in the nightmares that wake her every single night. You want to talk about proper authority? Then help me find who did this. Help me bring them to justice, or ride away and let me protect her in peace." The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut. Prescott's eyes moved past Elijah to the window where Sarah sat watching, her face pale and still, her hands clutching the quilt like a lifeline. Something in his expression shifted, hardened, closed off. He said, "I hope you know what you are doing, Cole. I hope you are ready for what comes next." Then he turned his horse and rode away, his men following, their hoofbeats fading into the distance and leaving behind a silence that felt heavy with warning. The days that followed were quiet on the surface but turbulent underneath, like a river frozen over with currents still flowing beneath the ice. Sarah began to speak more, not much, but enough that Elijah learned fragments of her story. How she had been taken from a wagon train 2 years ago, how she had been sold and traded like property, how she had ended up in that basement belonging to a man whose face she never saw clearly but whose voice she would remember until the day she died. She did not know his name. She did not know why he had chosen her or what he intended to do with her in the long run. She only knew that every few weeks he would come, would descend those stairs, would bring food and water and darkness that lasted for hours. She spoke of these things in a flat, disconnected voice, as if describing events that had happened to someone else, someone far away, someone whose pain she could observe but no longer feel. Elijah listened without interrupting. He did not push for details she was not ready to give. He simply sat with her by the fire in the evenings and let the silence between them become something comfortable instead of something to fear. He taught her small things, how to card wool, how to churn butter, how to read the tracks left by different animals in the mud around the barn. She learned quickly, her quick mind emerging from the darkness like a flower finding sunlight, and he caught himself smiling sometimes at the way her eyes lit up when she mastered a new skill or understood something that had previously confused her. She was smart. She was resilient. She was still broken in ways that might never fully heal, but she was trying, and that trying made him believe in things he had stopped believing in when he buried his family in the cold ground 3 winters ago. Then the stranger came to town. He arrived on a Tuesday, riding a black horse with white stockings, his clothes too fine for the dusty streets of Stillwater, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat that cast shadows across his features. He took a room at the boarding house and began asking questions, quiet questions, casual questions, questions about abandoned properties and missing persons, and whether anyone had seen a girl, young, probably malnourished, probably frightened, probably not speaking to anyone about where she had been. The questions reached Elijah's ears by Wednesday morning, carried by Martha Harding's husband who came to buy hay, and lingered long enough to share the news with worried eyes and a voice lowered to a whisper. Elijah listened without showing the cold dread spreading through his chest. He thanked Thomas S. Harding for the information and watched him ride away, and then stood very still for a long moment, his hands curled into fists at his sides, his mind racing through possibilities and preparations and the terrible arithmetic of protecting someone against a threat he did not fully understand. When he went inside, Sarah was standing by the window where she always stood, her face turned toward the light, her expression peaceful in a way that made his heart ache. He did not know how to tell her. He did not know how to say that the darkness she had escaped might be riding toward them on a black horse with white stockings, asking questions that would eventually lead right to this door. But she turned before he could find the words, and he saw in her eyes that she already knew. She had sensed it somehow, the way animals sense approaching storms, the way prey senses predators even when they cannot see them. She said, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands, "He is coming, is he not? The man from the basement, he is coming to take me back." Elijah crossed the room and knelt in front of her, taking her cold hands in his rough, calloused palms. He said, "No one is taking you anywhere. No one is putting you back in that darkness. I made a promise when I broke that chain, even if I did not say it out loud. I promised that you would be free. I promised that no one would hurt you again. And I keep my promises, Sarah. I always keep my promises." She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for the lie she had learned to expect from every adult who had ever touched her life. But there was no lie. There was only truth, hard and unyielding as the iron he had broken to set her free. She said, quiet and wondering, "Why, you do not even know me. You had a life before I came. You had peace. Why would you risk everything for someone you found in a basement?" He thought about his wife, about her gentle hands and her easy laughter, and the way she used to sing while she worked in the kitchen. He thought about his daughter, about her bright eyes and her endless questions, and the way she used to fall asleep in his arms after he told her stories about horses and heroes and all the adventures waiting for her in the world. He thought about the graves behind the barn and the emptiness they had left behind and the way grief had hollowed him out until he felt like nothing but a shell going through the motions of living. He said, "Because you deserve more than what was done to you. Because someone has to stand against the darkness when it comes. And because—" He paused, the words catching in his throat, the emotion threatening to break through the walls he had built so carefully around his heart. He said, "Because I had a daughter once. And I could not save her. I could not protect her from the fever that took her away from me. I would give anything to have her back, but she is gone, and you are here. And maybe that means something. Maybe it means I was supposed to find you. Maybe it means I have been given a second chance to do what I could not do before." Sarah's eyes filled with tears that she did not let fall. She squeezed his hands and said nothing, but her silence was answer enough. They understood each other now. They were both broken by loss, both haunted by darkness, both searching for something to hold on to in a world that seemed determined to take everything away. And in that moment, in the quiet of that small cabin with the prairie wind howling outside, they became something more than stranger and rescued child. They became family. The confrontation came on a Friday evening, just as the sun was beginning to set, and the sky was turning the color of bruises and fire. Elijah heard the hoofbeats first, a single horse, approaching slowly, the rhythm unhurried and confident. He told Sarah to stay inside, to lock the door and not come out no matter what she heard. Then he stepped onto the porch with his shotgun in his hands and watched the stranger ride into his yard like he owned every inch of ground his horse crossed. The man was younger than Elijah expected, perhaps 35, with pale eyes that caught the fading light and reflected it back without warmth. His clothes were expensive but practical, the clothes of a man who moved through the world expecting it to accommodate him. He stopped his horse 20 feet from the porch and sat there for a long moment, studying Elijah with an expression of mild curiosity, like a cat studying a mouse that had somehow learned to stand on its hind legs. Then he said, his voice smooth and cultured and wrong somehow, wrong in ways that made Elijah's skin crawl. "You must be Elijah Cole. I have heard a great deal about you, about your ranch, about your loss, about the girl you found on the Brennan property and brought into your home like a stray dog." Elijah said nothing. He simply waited, the shotgun heavy and reassuring in his hands, his eyes never leaving the stranger's face. The man continued, "Her name is Sarah, or at least that is the name she goes by now. She has had many names over the years. The first family that owned her called her Grace. The second called her nothing at all. I called her," he paused, smiled, "mine. She belonged to me, Mr. Cole. She was my property, acquired through legitimate channels, documented and paid for. And you took her without permission. That constitutes theft, sir. A hanging offense in this territory." The words hit Elijah like physical blows, but he did not flinch. He said, his voice low and dangerous, "Property. You call that child property. You chained her in a basement. You kept her in darkness. You treated her worse than any animal deserves to be treated. And you ride onto my land and speak of documentation and legitimate channels like we are discussing the purchase of cattle." The stranger's smile did not waver. He said, "Morality is a luxury, Mr. Cole. A comforting fiction created by those who have never had to make difficult choices. The world is harsh. Survival requires sacrifice. And some people are simply born to be used by others. It is the natural order. The strong take, the weak serve. Your sympathy for the girl is admirable in its way, but it changes nothing. She is mine. I want her back, and I will have her one way or another." The door behind Elijah opened. He turned, his heart lurching, and saw Sarah step onto the porch. She was wearing one of his daughter's old dresses, pale blue with white buttons, and her hair was clean and brushed and caught the last light of the dying sun like something precious and fragile. She looked at the stranger without flinching, without fear, and Elijah realized in that moment that she had come out not because she was afraid of what might happen, but because she was done hiding. She was done letting others fight her battles. She was done being property. She said, her voice steady and clear in the evening air, "You do not own me. You never owned me. You only borrowed me from the darkness for a while, and now I have found my way back to the light. I know your name now. I know your face. I remember everything you did to me in that basement, every word you spoke, every sound you made. And I will stand in front of any judge or jury in this territory and tell them exactly what kind of man you are. So ride away and never come back. Because if you try to take me, if you lay one finger on me or on the man who saved my life, I will destroy you. I will use every breath I have left to make sure the whole world knows the truth about you." The silence that followed was absolute. The stranger's smile had finally faded, replaced by something hard and calculating and dangerous. He looked at Sarah, then at Elijah, then back at Sarah. He said, quiet now, the smoothness gone from his voice, "You think anyone will believe you? A vagrant child with no family, no papers, no proof of anything except your own word, against me. Against my money, my connections, my reputation. You are nothing. You have always been nothing. And you will always be nothing, no matter how many ranchers take pity on you and dress you up in dead girls' clothes." Elijah felt the rage building inside him, white-hot and terrible, but before he could act, another sound reached his ears, more hoofbeats, approaching from the direction of town. He looked up and saw a dozen riders emerging from the gathering dusk, led by Sheriff Marcus Brennan, Thomas Harding, and to his surprise, Jacob Prescott. They rode into his yard and formed a loose semicircle around the stranger, their faces grim and determined in the fading light. Sheriff Brennan said, "Aldrich Carver. I received a telegram this afternoon from the marshal in Kansas City. They have been looking for you for 3 years, 12 girls, 12 children bought and sold and disappeared across 4 states. We found 3 of them buried on the Brennan property this afternoon, thanks to some digging done by my deputies. You are under arrest for murder, kidnapping, and crimes against humanity that I do not even have words for." The stranger, Carver, went very still. His pale eyes moved from face to face, calculating odds, measuring distances, searching for an escape that did not exist. Then something changed in his expression, something broke, and he reached for the pistol at his hip. Elijah fired first. The shotgun blast caught Carver in the shoulder and spun him from his horse, dropping him into the dirt where he lay groaning and clutching at his wound while his blood soaked into the ground. The sheriff dismounted and walked over to him, handcuffs catching the last light of day, and said, "That shoulder will heal enough for you to stand trial, and then you will hang, and no one in this territory or any other will mourn you for a single second." They took Carver away as the stars emerged overhead, one by one, scattered across the darkness like promises waiting to be kept. Sarah stood on the porch watching until the riders disappeared over the horizon, and then she turned to Elijah with something in her eyes that he had not seen before. Not hope, not exactly, but something close, something fragile and new and worth protecting. She said, "Is it over? Is it really over?" He put his arm around her shoulders, felt her lean into him, felt the weight of her trust settling over him like a blessing he did not deserve but would spend the rest of his life trying to earn. He said, "The worst part is over. The rest," he paused, looking out at the land he had worked for 20 years, the land that had seen so much sorrow and was finally, perhaps, about to see something different. He said, "The rest we build together, one day at a time, one moment at a time, for as long as it takes." Sarah lived with Elijah Cole for 15 years. She helped him run the ranch, learned to ride and rope and brand cattle with the best of his hired hands. She went to school in town when the circuit teacher came through, devouring books and knowledge with a hunger that never quite faded. She testified at Aldrich Carver's trial and watched him hang without flinching, without crying, without giving him the satisfaction of seeing her break. And when she turned 29, she married a quiet blacksmith named Samuel Cooper, the son of the blacksmith who had fixed Elijah's tools all those years ago, and had 3 children of her own, 2 daughters and a son, all of whom grew up knowing exactly how precious life and freedom truly were. Elijah lived long enough to hold his grandchildren, to tell them stories by the fire, to feel the circle of love expanding outward from that terrible day when he had broken a chain and found something worth fighting for. He died on a spring morning when the meadowlarks were singing and the cottonwood trees were dropping their white fluff across the prairie like snow in reverse. Sarah was with him at the end, holding his hand, telling him that it was all right, that he could rest now, that he had done more good in this world than he would ever know. His last words were a whisper she had to lean close to hear, and they were simple and true and enough. He said, "I found you in the darkness, and you brought me back to light." Sarah buried him beside his wife and daughter, under the cottonwood tree where he had always said he wanted to rest. She stood at the grave for a long time after the others had gone, remembering the sound of his voice and the strength of his arms and the way he had looked at her on that first day, with eyes that held no judgment, no suspicion, only the quiet determination to do what was right regardless of the cost. She whispered into the wind, "You broke more than a chain that day. You broke every wall I had built around my heart. You showed me that kindness still existed in a world that had tried to convince me it did not. I will carry you with me forever, and I will make sure your grandchildren know your name." The wind moved through the cottonwood leaves, sounding almost like a voice, almost like a promise, almost like the echo of love reaching across the divide between worlds. Sarah dried her eyes and walked back toward the ranch, toward the life she had built from the ashes of her suffering, toward the family waiting for her in the house where she had first learned what it meant to be seen, to be valued, to be human. Behind her, the prairie stretched endlessly toward the horizon, wild and beautiful and full of stories waiting to be told. And somewhere in that vastness, in the space between earth and sky, the spirit of a rancher named Elijah Cole rode on, watching over the girl he had saved and the legacy of love they had created together, forever and always, until the end of time itself.